I'm just trying to get you down precisely about the public service, the core public service, because there was a bit of uncertainty, I guess, at the last election about whether there was a cap or a cut, and I won't go into the semantics about that. But are the core numbers going to drop significantly, do you think, over the next few years?
Well, I think the numbers are probably going to drop.
Yeah. We're at 43,000 at the moment.
Well, look, the wider public service is closer to quarter of a million.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why it has to drop, there was two reasons. One is we've got to get back to surplus because we've got to stop borrowing more money. And the world's giving us that message all the time.
Yeah.
And the credit rating downgrade is just another shot there from the lenders saying, you're a little country, you've got a big mortgage, you've got a big overdraft, actually you've got to stop behaving like this. And New Zealanders have got that message. The other reason it needs to change is because if we want higher incomes, if we want less inequality, we need the ability for people to lift their incomes, and the sources of growth that are going to feed those higher incomes are changing rapidly. So in the last 10 years it was the government. The government grew fast, that grew a lot of incomes. It was a housing boom. Big construction sector grew a lot of incomes. It was funded by borrowing. So people were getting higher incomes, but they were borrowing the money. In the next 10 years, we're going to have to earn it from the rest of the world because they're not going to lend it to us.
Okay.
So the public sector has to stabilise or shrink so that the people and the capital tied up in it can move into the export and tradable sector. Where we can earn from the rest of the world.
Are you talking sizable cuts, or are you just talking about, amelioration of the public sector?
Well, it depends on what your definition is.
Well,
in the last budget, we laid out a spending track, right? We said, right, this is what we're going to spend for the next 4 years, and that includes the public sector spending or producing about $1 billion in savings. Now that's out of 60 billion. So $1 billion out of 60 billion, we think that's manageable. Okay,
but what happens if Treasury's doomsday scenario does eventuate? They've talked about it in the PREFU this week of a 20% chance of things going pretty badly globally, which will have an impact here. Won't that necessitate even bigger cuts and bigger sort of reforms?
Well, that's possible.
Yeah.
Right?
So where's National going to do it? What's National going to do?
Well, because we haven't gone into a lot of detail about that.
And a few of no parties are.
No parties are.
But still, we, as voters, we really should know, shouldn't we, that if things do hit the wall and get as bad as it could happen, what's National going to do about it? Who's going to pay the price? Who's going to get the cuts?
Yeah, well, we haven't done the work on that specifically. I mean, certainly if the world changes, then we've got to change what we do. I mean, that's happened before, and we went into the 2008 election making a whole lot of undertakings. The world changed within a couple of weeks when Lehman's crashed.
Yeah.
And what we did there actually was maintain the undertakings we'd made, despite the fact that things had changed. So there's some things that we want to remain pretty fixed on, which would be protecting the most vulnerable, getting back to surplus, and that could mean further squeezing in some other places.
So you're going into this campaign still promising to retain working for families, retain interest-free student loans like you did at the last election?
Well, the most recently in the last budget, what we said with those bigger programs is we were trimming them, which is about making smaller changes that add up over time. So if you take working for families, we made some smallish changes, which mean that instead of it, in 3 or 4 years' time, instead of it costing $3.5 billion a year, it'll cost about $2.5 billion. Families will actually get a 5% increase in their payment sometime in the next 18 months.
Okay.
Anyway, so we've trimmed it in a way that we believe is sustainable under, the normal range of economic outcomes. Look, if there's a meltdown, everything changes.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
I'm stepping. Many people think that one of the reasons why we have so much debt is because wages are really low, wages are stagnant, especially at the bottom end of the scale. We have a question on Twitter. It says, is low wage growth due to poor management by National, or is it the intended consequence of your policies?
So question A or B, answer A or B.
It's not neither of those, actually. I mean, in the end, where does the money come from for the wages? And what we've found is that too much of it has been coming from borrowings, one directly or indirectly. and the world's not going to lend us any more money. So for future wage growth, we've got to earn it somewhere. And as we've said, it's not going to come from fast growth in government, although of course there'll be wage rises in government. It's going to have to come from selling stuff to the rest of the world. So the way I would put it is the real estate agents have to turn into food technologists. Okay, because...
Diversifying the economy would be a sensible way to deal with that, in the sense that we depend so much on agriculture and it's so bad for the environment, like in the long term, if we're going to transition to a carbon economy. Just what do you think about it?
Yeah, well, look, diversification is a great idea, and actually we have we're not totally dependent on agriculture. We have quite a broad range of other industries, including very successful businesses in Dunedin that are nothing to do with agriculture, that are feeding off the the kind of knowledge base here around the university. And you can argue some of those will be lower carbon, although the carbon economics of a lot of these cities is not that well understood in my view. There's a fair bit of mythology about it. With agriculture, I think the point there is to think it's turning out that it's a comparative advantage to be a food producer with water, and we have the very high levels of availability of water. There's only Iceland who's ahead of us, and you've got to melt theirs before you can use it, as is readily available. And so the world is showing, particularly the Asia Pacific world, that there's more people willing to pay more for our food, and so we should build on that comparative advantage. The constraints on that are public concerns about the environment.
Or like if we got foot and mouth, for example.
That would wipe you out. Yeah. But if we
one major thing we rely on so much, we're kind of like limiting it. So.
Yeah, but if we were reliant on financial services, we would have been wiped out. If we'd been relying on sort of mid-technology manufacturing, we would have been wiped out in the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, there's risks with whatever you're in, but you're quite right. We've got to deal with the constraints. We've got to deal with the limits of production around agriculture.
Okay, there's a couple of questions in the audience and on the Twitter sphere. I notice Andrew Ames in the Twitter sphere is saying, do you think we should be having a debate about the retirement age? And associated with that, someone else is saying that the Labour Party's retirement policy has just been leaked. What are your thoughts? But I don't know what
I don't know what it is.
If someone can tell us on Twitter what the Labour policy leaked.
It looks like he's saying they're planning to raise it.
67. So what's your thoughts? Should we have a debate on the age, and what about 67?
Well, I think there has been a debate, and there is a debate. It's quite a legitimate debate. The government took a position before the last election that it wouldn't change the retirement age.
Was that the government or just John Key?
Oh, it's the government.
Same thing.
Yes, okay. And that's an issue of trust in the end. So if the Prime Minister says that the retirement age isn't going to change, that has given a lot of older people a sense of security about national super, and we're not changing that position.
What about yourself? I mean, would you make that promise? Some people especially on the right, say that was a very silly promise to make because it's such an important debate to have. We can't just go off and say, well, I'll resign if it goes up. Would you make that promise that you'd resign from Parliament if the retirement age goes up?
Well, it's a very hypothetical question.
Well, it's... John Key's made the promise. What about you?
Yeah, well, no, it's the government's promise. Prime Minister makes that on behalf of the government. That is the
But I don't think he was saying the whole government would resign. He'd say, him personally, this is my statement. Would you make that statement?
Well, look, the government has made the statement that once it is the government's position. It's my position, it's Mr Woodhouse's position, it's Joe Hayes' position as the candidate.
Okay.
And I think people forget the context for that. We'd had 20 or 30 years of debate in New Zealand about super, about national superannuation going right back to 1975, and it had reached a kind of resolution, and National in opposition felt it was important to acknowledge that resolution and lock it in by having a period of stability, and that's worked well.
Yeah,
I think a lot
but that's
of
been more about politics than economics. So what about 67 then? Labor says 67 apparently. What do you think? Is that, we are getting older, well not getting older, we are having living longer, so perhaps 67 is a more appropriate age.
Well look, some government in the future may may well look at that.
Okay.
But we're not.
Okay, but you're not condemning Labor's 7-year retirement age.
Well, look,
at this stage.
It could give you the false impression that somehow in the next 4 or 5 years it's going to make a difference. Of course, it won't.
What about United Futures policy? It seems quite interesting. I think it's a retirement age of 60. Well, that's when the payments would start, but you'd have reduced payments for the first 5 years, and if you wanted, you could retire and take it on later and receive higher payments. It seems quite creative. And
again, that's you have to look at the detail of it as to whether people are better off or not better off. I mean,
I think he's saying that basically the same amount would be spent, but it would allow those, say, I guess ethnic groups in particular that have shorter lifespans to be able to access it. Working people that are burnt out earlier would have access to retiring earlier.
Look, there's any number of versions of retirement policy you can debate. What we were focusing on and still focus on is providing stability so that people know what the policy is and it's not going to change.
Okay, we've got another question here from Peter, I think it is, in the audience.
Does National plan to privatise any of the state assets such as New Zealand Post, Meridian Energy or Mercury Energy or New Zealand in the future?
Okay, so state asset sales, which ones are you going to privatise, if any?
Yeah, well, we've been pretty clear cut about that. We're going to have maintain majority government ownership of all the current assets and sell down up to 49% of 5 companies that we've listed, including one in Meridian, Mighty River, Genesis. There's 3 energy companies. And what we want to do there is take the capital we get from that partial sale to apply to other government investment, which is like schools, hospitals, prisons, stuff that we have to do. And that means we can avoid having to go and borrow more from the financial markets, and it means New Zealanders get an opportunity to invest in something alongside housing and alongside the government.
Is National effectively ruling out vetoing the sale of New Zealand Post, any of TVNZ, etc.?
Yeah, well, we're ruling out doing that. Yeah, in the next term, we've said what we're going to do if we're re-elected.
Okay.
So we followed through on what we said 3 years ago. No sales. If we were going to sell anything, we would put it to the electorate, and so that's what we're doing.
Okay. I guess some on the right would say, why stop at 49%? What's the state doing owning Air New Zealand at all, for example? What's your response to them?
Oh, well, I think there's the public at large and the government sees some benefits in government ownership, but we're trying to get the best of both worlds, and that is, the level of public comfort about who owns these significant assets on the one hand, but a higher level of performance and better government access to capital on the other hand. So
you're sort of having to balance up political and economics in the terms of not going somewhere where you'd like to go perhaps, but you just can't because of the distaste for full privatisation.
Yeah, and I think there's also some practical limits on it. You're talking about $5 to $7 billion worth of assets here, and there's only so much of that people can pay for.
Okay. Now, in these vote chats we normally ask